Episode 4.
"Do please get up," Charles said. "I don't like to see you lying there that way. You're carrying things too far."
Have you ever tried to get to your feet with a sprained dignity?
But Mrs. Whatsit scrambled up right at the chair and then sat back down on the floor. The booted foot stuck out in front of her and took another bite. She moved with great agility for such an old woman. At least Meg was reasonably sure that she was an old woman, and a very old woman at that. Mrs. Whatsit, her mouth full, ordered Mrs. Murray,
"Now pull while I'm already down."
quite calmly, as though this old woman and her boots were nothing out of the ordinary. Mrs. Murray pulled until the second boot relinquished the foot. This foot was covered with a blue and gray argyle sock, and Mrs. Whatsit sat there wriggling her toes, contentedly finishing her sandwich before scrambling to her feet.
"Ah,"
she said,
"that's ever so much better.
and took both boots and shook them out over the sink.
My stomach is full, and I'm warm inside and out, and it's time I went home."
"Don't you think you'd better stay till morning?" Mrs. Murray asked.
"Oh, thank you, dearie, but there's so much to do, I just can't waste time sitting around frivoling."
"It's much too wild a night to travel in,"
"Wild nights are my glory,"
Mrs. Whatsit said.
"I just got caught in a downdraft and blown off course."
"Well, at least till your socks are dry."
"Wet socks don't bother me. I just didn't like the water squishing around in my boots. Now, don't worry about me, lamb."
Lamb was not a word one would ordinarily think of calling Mrs. Murray.
"I shall just sit down for a moment and pop on my boots, and then I'll be on my way. Speaking of ways, pet, by the way, there is such a thing as a tesseract."
Mrs. Murray went very white, and with one hand reached backward and clutched at a chair for support. Her voice trembled. "What did you say?" Mrs. Whatsit tugged at her second boot.
"I said,"
she grunted, shoving her foot down in,
"that there is such a thing as a tesseract."
Her foot went down into the boot, and grabbing shawls, scarves, and hat, she hustled out the door. Mrs. Murray stayed very still, making no move to help the old woman. As the door opened, Fortinbras streaked in, panting, wet and shiny as a seal. He looked at Mrs. Murray and whined. The door slammed.
"Mother, what's the matter?" Meg cried. "What did she say? What is it?"
"The tesseract," Mrs. Murray whispered. What did she mean? How could she have known? Chapter 2. Mrs. Who. When Meg woke to the jangling of her alarm clock, the wind was still blowing, but the sun was shining. The worst of the storm was over. She sat up in bed, shaking her head to clear it. It must have been a dream. She'd been frightened by the storm and worried about the tramp, so she just dreamed about going down to the kitchen and seeing Mrs. Whatsit and having her mother get all frightened and upset by that word. What was it? Tess something. She dressed hurriedly, picked up the kitten, still curled up on the bed, and dumped it unceremoniously on the floor. The kitten yawned, stretched, gave a piteous meow, trotted out of the attic, and went downstairs. Meg made her bed and hurried after it. In the kitchen, her mother was making French toast, and the twins were already at the table. The kitten was lapping milk out of a saucer. "Where's Charles?" Meg asked. "Still asleep. We had rather an interrupted night, if you remember." "I hoped it was a dream," Meg said. Her mother carefully turned over 4 slices of French toast, then said in a steady voice, "No, Meg, don't hope it was a dream. I don't understand it any more than you do, but one thing I've learned is that you don't have to understand things for them to be. I'm sorry I showed you I was upset. Your father and I used to have a joke about tesseract." "What is a tesseract?" Meg asked. "It's a concept." Mrs. Murray handed the twins the syrup. "I'll try to explain it to you later. There isn't time before school." "I don't see why you didn't wake us up," Dennis said. "It's a gyp we missed out on all the fun." "You'll be a lot more awake in school today than I will." Meg took her French toast to the table. "Who cares?" Sandy said. "If you're going to let old tramps come into the house in the middle of the night, Mother, you ought to have Den and me around to protect you." "After all, Father would expect us to," Dennis added. "We know you have a great mind and all, Mother," Sandy said, "but you don't have much sense, and certainly Meg and Charles don't." "I know. We're morons." Meg was bitter. "I wish you wouldn't be such a dope, Meg." "Syrup, please." Sandy reached across the table. "You don't have to take everything so personally. Use a happy medium, for heaven's sake. You just goof around in school and look out the window and don't pay any attention." "You just make things harder for yourself," Dennis said. "And Charles Wallace is going to have an awful time next year when he starts school. We know he's bright, but he's so funny when he's around other people, and they're so used to thinking he's dumb, I don't know what's going to happen to him. Sandy and I'll sock anybody who picks on him, but that's about all we can do." "Let's not worry about next year until we get through this one," Mrs. Murray said. "More French toast, boys?" At school, Meg was tired, and her eyelids sagged and her mind wandered. In social studies, she was asked to name the principal imports and exports of Nicaragua, and though she had looked them up dutifully the evening before, now she could remember none of them. The teacher was sarcastic. The rest of the class laughed, and she flung herself down in her seat in a fury. "Who cares about the imports and exports of Nicaragua anyhow?" she muttered. "If you're going to be rude, Margaret, you may leave the room," the teacher said. "Okay, I will." Meg flounced out. During study hall, the principal sent for her. "What seems to be the problem now, Meg?" he asked, pleasantly enough. Meg looked sulkily down at the floor. "Nothing, Mr. Jenkins." "Miss Porter tells me you were inexcusably rude." Meg shrugged. "Don't you realize that you just make everything harder for yourself by your attitude?" the principal asked. "Now, Meg, I'm convinced that you can do the work and keep up with your grade if you will apply yourself, but some of your teachers are not. You're going to have to do something about yourself. Nobody can do it for you." Meg was silent. "Well, what about it, Meg?" "I don't know what to do," Meg said. "Well, you could do your homework for one thing. Wouldn't your mother help you?" "If I asked her to." "Meg, is something troubling you? Are you unhappy at home?" Mr. Jenkins asked. At last, Meg looked at him, pushing at her glasses in a characteristic gesture. "Everything's fine at home." "I'm glad to hear it, but I know it must be hard on you to have your father away." Meg eyed the principal warily and ran her tongue over the barbed line of her braces. "Have you had any news from him lately?" Meg was sure it was not only imagination that made her feel that behind Mr. Jenkins' surface concern was a gleam of avid curiosity. Wouldn't he like to know, she thought. And if I knew anything, he'd be the last person I'd tell. Well, one of the last. The postmistress must know that it was almost a year now since the last letter. And heaven knows how many people she'd told, or what unkind guesses she'd made about the reason for the long silence.